I feel like for most people, the problem is that they don't really have any structure for their efforts. So they're not really working against any kind of concrete goal or concrete project. They're not allocating any time toward it. So it's a little bit like saying, well, what's the right way of optimizing something that no one's doing? And so in this case, I think what I would like to suggest is
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Being Yourself Show, where world's renowned thought leaders, best selling authors, and entrepreneurs share their wisdom and insight to help you achieve your goal and be super productive. If you are new to this channel, then please do consider subscribing to this channel by clicking on subscribe button and the bell icon to have your weekly dose of motivation, inspiration, and knowledge. This episode is being recorded in association with Let's Localize, an organization with a mission to foster micro contributions from communities and businesses to support schools for their need of time, skill, and money. To know more about Let's Localize, click on the card above or the link in description below. I'm your host, Ajay Mathur, and my guest today is a globally sought after speaker and entrepreneur and a best-selling author who loves to take different challenges with regards to learning. In 2012, he decided to take a 4-year computer science course from MIT without attending a single class, and he did complete that course within a year, and he passed all 30 to 35 exams of it. 2 years later, he wanted to learn 4 different languages, and to do that, he traveled to 4 different countries with a friend, and he did not speak English for the whole year. And if that was not enough, he wanted to learn how to draw human faces, and you can see how well he has achieved that goal. For his different approach about learning, he has been featured in many media outlets such as BBC, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, just to name a few. So please welcome the author of Wall Street Journal best-selling book, Ultra Learning, Scott Young. Scott, welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you for having me. I'm not sure I can live up to such a grand introduction, but I'll do my best in this
I'm
conversation.
101% sure you will. So I read a lot about you before jumping onto this interview. And first
Mhm.
thing I want to ask you, what did you find wrong with the way we learn things so that you went so deep into learning and even wrote a book and so much of blogging that you have done? So what's your inspiration? What's your why to take this to this level?
Right. So I think it all started for me with just an enthusiasm for learning. And I kind of got into doing this by uncovering people who did sort of what I call these ultra learning projects, where they learn something very intensively on their own, often with a real eye for how do you optimize the process. They often did things that seemed incredible to me. So these are projects that predated mine, but Steve Pavlina was one that I really looked after, and he did a double major in mathematics and computer science in over 3 semesters, doing like a triple course load. Benny Lewis is someone that I feature prominently in the book, who has learned many languages, and he had a website called Fluent in 3 months, where he would go to a new country and then like from the ground he would start learning, and he was doing this by speaking with people a lot and engaging in a lot of immersive practice. And so these people really kind of inspired me in my own projects. And having done them over several years, I thought I wanted to try to give other people the opportunity to hear from these examples and maybe question some of their assumptions about how they've learned things in the past and open their minds to maybe some new processes. I wouldn't say that everyone's doing everything wrong and I have some kind of magic secret, but I do think that the average person doesn't really think that much about what goes into learning efficiently, what are the mental processes that go into it. And so, just the same way that I like going for a jog, but I'm not going to be trained at the level of like an elite sprinter. There's probably some training steps that I'm missing if I wanted to be a faster runner. I think that there's probably similar processes going into being a faster and more effective learner. That if you understand some of these principles, if you experiment with them and you learn with these kinds of methods and techniques, you can often do things that maybe are a little bit more efficient than you were doing before, and sometimes a lot more efficient. And so this is what I wanted to highlight in the book.
And which of the areas in the current way of learning you found that this is not really right and I definitely need to start some looking into this?
Well, definitely, I think just from kind of casual observation, I feel like a lot of language learning is difficult for students. And I don't want to put too much blame on teachers. I'm imagining I'm already going to get heat from language teachers for saying that I'm presumptuous enough to say that they're doing it wrong. But rather, it's that the way that we often encounter languages is as this sort of academic subject in school. We don't actually have to use it to communicate anything. And so it becomes this sort of sterile exercise of memorizing some vocabulary, doing some grammar drills. And I've known people who've done years and years of language instruction that can't competently carry out a conversation. And to me, this is because this kind of paradigm for learning, doing classes is probably fine, but it's probably not enough to really do what you need to do to learn a language well. And all of the people I've encountered who are really excellent at learning languages tend to prefer an approach that's involves a lot more real communication. So they're going out and they're speaking with people, they're engaging in conversations early, or even the people who are, let's say, not quite as focused on being outgoing and speaking, they're still using sort of native media and listening and reading and focusing on real use scenarios rather than just doing this kind of dry exercise. And I think that's a general sort of tendency across a lot of education, that the way it gets first presented to us knowledge is in this sort of removed from the real world abstracted context. And there's a lot of research that shows that we do a bad job at transferring it back to the real situation that we care about. So a lot of the people I highlighted in this book, they had a lot more of a kind of getting your hands dirty, learning by doing approach, as opposed to a really highly academic, removed from the real world. I'm just going to, study some books and not actually go out there and practice.
I do agree with you because I personally know some language teachers who, if you send them to talk to the native people in that language, they might struggle a bit. Although they can talk, but they won't be as fluent as. So you actually did it in 1 year. You learned 4 different languages and you went to different countries. Tell us a little bit more about your approach. How did you do it and how proficient you became at the end of the semester?
Right. Yeah. So this was a really fun project. I didn't do it alone, so I can't take I can't take too much credit. I went with a friend of mine, and we went to 4 different countries. We went to Spain, Brazil, China, and South Korea to learn Spanish, Portuguese, Mandarin, Chinese, and Korean. And the idea of the project, which I should be clear, like this was just sort of an experiment. It's easy to talk about it with hindsight, but the idea was, well, how well could you learn a language if the principle you used going into it was, as soon as you got off the plane, you wouldn't speak English to the largest extent possible. I don't want to give the impression that we were 100% perfect in all moments of the challenge, but with that as the operating principle, as opposed to, I think, what most people would do, especially if you don't speak a language, is, well, I'll try to learn a little bit, and maybe when I'm ready, I'll speak a bit. Whereas this was like, we're definitely not ready, but we're going to try to do it anyways. And what we found was that while I certainly wouldn't claim that we reached the highest echelons of fluency in any of these languages, we reached a level which was quite proficient for a lot of everyday situations, I think much earlier than most people would expect, certainly than we expected. We kind of went into it as it was a hypothesis. And so I think just the kind of experience we had, especially in the first country we had in Spain, really converted us that, like, oh no, this is the right method. This works so much better than everything else. And so we worked on that project over the year. And I would say that it was for the kinds of things that a lot of people would like to learn a language for, to be able to live in a country, to make friends, to go on dates, to, socialize, to be able to read books and do these kinds of things. It was quite successful. And so this isn't to, try to inflate our results too much. And you can watch videos of us speaking to get some idea if you speak any of those languages. But I think one of the goals that I have in writing this book and showing this is just that I think the perspective I would have had prior to meeting Benny Lewis, prior to hearing about other people doing projects like this, is that, oh, well, you study a language for maybe 4 or 5 years, and then maybe you start having conversations, and then you can like go there, and it takes like, a decade or so to be able to speak a language. So just the idea that, in a couple of months you could get to a level where you're able to do these things was at least something new for me.
So it's kind of put it in practice earlier at very early stages when you start learning it really. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and I like think there's a couple factors that made it work. So one is, I think this is particularly true if you're going to another place that speaks a language. So if you know you're going to another country and they speak that language, a big pitfall that people get into is that they don't speak it very well. So they naturally gravitate to friends and people that speak the language they speak. And I think this is extremely true for people who speak English as a native language, because anywhere you go in the world, there's going to be a community of English speakers. It doesn't matter how remote it is, pretty much. And so, if you want to have a social circle that only speaks English, it's pretty much possible to do that in any major city in the world. It's a little harder if you speak kind of an obscure language, maybe not. There's not going to be a big group of Hungarian speakers in the city you're going to, but even then I've found people who have, don't speak the local language, who manage to find, some friends or family members, and those are the people that they stick to. And so one of the main reasons that this works is that you're actually creating a different social circle, not one that will reinforce your native language, but if you start making friends in this new language, then just to live your life, you have to be using it all the time. So you're getting all these learning opportunities. The second thing that I think is really important is that the way you're learning the language is very optimized for um, actual situations that you're encountering. And so I think that's one of the ways that it's somewhat hard to compare the project that we did with, let's say, someone who does a more formal schooling approach, because there are certainly going to be large gaps in our speaking ability compared to someone who studied it formally. To use an example, like in Spanish, my friend who he wasn't as keen on studying grammar, didn't conjugate any of his verbs for like the first month. And that's something that you would learn like day one in a school. So they would probably, really frown on that if you were, not saying any conjugated verbs. But it didn't matter. He was learning enough that people who didn't speak English could understand him and he could communicate. And that allowed him to bootstrap these sort of relationships in these environments for practice. And so I think when you are doing direct practice, when you are kind of in it, then you often learn things that are maximally practical, maximally useful for your particular situation. Whereas when you do a lot of formal study, you're sort of relying on a teacher being like, well, this is probably the right place to start, or you should learn these words. And so I don't know, I find a lot of books will have like, they'll have lists of like every single occupation someone might have, or all types of different farm animals. But like, how often do you use farm animals in a sentence? But there's a lot of words that we were using, from the very first day, that are not normally covered in an intro class. So, we were recording a lot of videos at the time. So recording video was one of the words that we would learn on day one, as opposed to learning it, months later. And so this kind of frequency shifting, of shifting to learning the most useful stuff immediately, I think is a boon to any project, language learning or otherwise.
So if I compare it with the traditional way of learning, it means when you go to the school will teach you that, okay, this is a word and these are another words, and this is grammar, this is how you connect the words to make a sentence, and so on and on and on. And then these are the fundamentals that you teach in schools. Versus your method, which is you just go jump into the wild and see how people are talking and try to understand, like the very small children start to learn speaking, right? Uh,
Yeah.
so are we not missing out on the fundamental side with your method? Let's say,
Mm-hmm.
can we still be a language expert, like we could be author in that language, or will it be any faster compared to the fundamental approach, or how do you
Well,
see it?
so I think 2 points are worth mentioning here. So one is that I'm not anti fundamentals. I would say quite the opposite. I tend to like studying and knowing why things work and understanding the grammar. So I don't want to be misconstrued as saying like that stuff is useless, but I think the problem is that it's not paired to any real context. So you often learn it in the classroom, and the actual kind of connective tissue that's necessary to use those muscles that are built in the classroom is never developed. And so if you're not doing a lot of actual real practice, you get into real situations and you have all this formal knowledge and you're trying to piece it together for the first time. Whereas what we would do is, we had moments where we're studying every day the language. So we were learning grammar. I was doing grammar books. I was doing vocabulary flashcards. So I was doing the stuff that you would do in a normal classroom. We got tutors in each of the languages so that they would kind of help us with things. but that there were so many motivating contexts where it's like, okay, I need to know how to say this, or I need to know how to deal with this particular situation. And so it would be like often on the fly, you're picking up your phone and trying to figure out what a word is so you can say it to someone so you can communicate. And that, I think, that sort of constantly being in a situation where you're being pulled towards the knowledge rather than just having, okay, this is a big list of stuff I have to memorize so that I can pass the test, I think is a bit of a distinction in the approach. Now, I will say that there are definitely language schools that adopt more of an immersive approach that kind of resembles more closely the approach we're taking. So I don't want to claim some kind of grand innovation here, but I do think that what I try to talk about in ultra learning is taking the perspective of the student. Because I think often a lot of innovations in education come from the perspective of the teacher, of how can we make these kids do what we want them to do. And unfortunately, I think, one of the things I discuss in this book is that there's often this trade-off that the thing that really works for learning is more effortful and more deliberate. And so if you yourself are not like, I want to learn well and I want to do this well, you're going to maybe somewhat undercut what maybe the curriculum is. So I've definitely heard situations where there'll be language schools that'll run like an immersion only process because they understand this principle. They're not stupid, but they find the students undercut it. They don't follow it. They're going to, wow, that's too hard. I'm not going to do that. So the perspective I'm taking is not like this is how we should reform all of education, but rather giving a message to the students directly to say that if you want to learn things well, there is a process for doing it that is maybe more effective than what you would do by default. And if you understand that process, then it's kind of up to you whether you want to undertake it. And so my projects and some of the things that I've worked on have been trying to illustrate maybe some extremes of what might be possible if you were to take things seriously.
And that has actually approach has become very popular. And we had recently an interview with Esther Wojcicki. I'll put the link here. Her approach is to have kids derive the learning experience. So she gives them full freedom. She hardly speaks in the class, but she gives all the resources required to whatever. And her school has got, I think, the maximum number of journals published in the US, or she's got some good big stats there. Okay. You talk a lot about unlearning the way we have learned the approach towards learning. It's a mouthful, it's a lot of learning.
Yeah.
I got an example of this. I recently learned how to do speed reading, and I definitely do agree that we need to unlearn the way we have understood how the reading works, which was like read word by word. And in this exercise, this speed reading, we try to read the whole sentence, right? Or maybe a couple of lines altogether. So that's the practice. That is how we start. It's like you starting from the sentences. So in order to move to that speed reading stage, we have to unlearn the reading word by word education that we've got, right? And that is so difficult. It is so
Mhm.
difficult to unlearn what we already know compared to learning new things. What are your examples and some more approaches to unlearn your traditional way of getting things?
Well, I think that part of it is that we are, to borrow an expression, we're cognitive misers. And so we don't like to expend mental effort when it's not needed. And the problem is that kind of learning is the sort of quintessential example of something that requires mental effort, because it's much easier to use a kind of default way of thinking or habit pattern than it is to do something different. And although we often think of learning as being an accumulative process, so you are, learning things you didn't know before, so there was just a blank space there and now there's knowledge or skill, this isn't probably the best way to think about it. I think a better way of thinking about it is that when you are learning something, you are adding kind of discriminations or new processes that weren't there before. So if you're riding a bicycle and you're learning to get better at riding a bicycle, you're kind of overriding what your body's tendency is to do. I don't know if anyone remembers when they started riding a bicycle, but it's kind of counterintuitive because you start like leaning in one direction and your idea is that, well, I should turn the wheel in that direction, and that can even make it worse. You can fall over. And so you actually have to like do sort of the opposite. It's called counter steering. And this is a very unconscious process, but what your body is doing is sort of overriding a kind of pre-existing impulse. And I think for a lot of the things that we learn, we aren't blank slates. We already have some kind of intuition about it, maybe some knowledge that's false or some ideas that are wrong or some kind of instinct that we're trying to override. And so I think with the learning process itself, these two things can kind of conspire: the fact that we don't want to put in too much effort, and also the fact that the learning that we're doing as well, our brain is trying to find some way of how do I get the result I want without actually changing any of my behavior, without actually learning something new. And so I'll give an example of this that I talk about in the book, which I think is something that every student should know. And that is that there is ample research that shows that when you are studying the way that most students study, which is where you reopen the book and you reread your notes, or you look over the things that you're trying to learn over and over again, this is actually really ineffective for tests. That what you need to do is you need to close the book and try to recall from within. And part of the problem, one of the barriers for this, is not only is recalling from within more taxing, more difficult, we find it more unpleasant. So if you're just giving me the choice of reading over my notes and closing the book and trying to remember everything that's in it, I'm going to choose the former just from it's more pleasurable. But the second thing is that we get kind of a false opinion about our knowledge from that, because as we read it over and over and over again, it becomes more and more familiar to us. So we feel like we're learning more and more. The problem is that doesn't translate very well to the test, so that when we actually have to do the test, the fact that you looked at it 5 or 6 times doesn't really matter that much. It helps, but it's not super important. Whereas when you close the book and you recall from within, you're actually strengthening those search patterns in your brain for bringing up the knowledge. And so we have examples where of studies where they've gotten people to use these two different learning techniques, and the people who do free recall, when they're sort of quizzed on how well they think they'll do on a test, they give themselves the lowest score, but when they actually do the test, they get the highest score. And so there's a bit of a paradox here in that if you are not aware of this principle of recall, and you're just sort of, okay, well, I want to do whatever feels like I'm learning the most, you may gravitate to actually something that's a lot less effective. And so I think this is something that happens a lot of times. To use another example, we were talking about language learning. I think that this is one of the major reasons that people avoid real communication situations, because they do them and they're really, really hard. They can't communicate very well. They're tripping up. They're speaking much less articulately. It's super slow. They're 5 seconds in between words where they're looking something up. And so they tell themselves, oh, I'm not performing very well at all, so I ought to go back down a level, practice more at the basics, and then go back and try it again. And I think the kind of lesson I'm trying to describe is but you're actually learning about as fast as you can go when you're doing it directly and actually practicing it. And so this is a sort of recurring theme in my book, where something that's a little bit harder and more deliberate produces better results than the kind of status quo or default path. And students, if they don't know about these principles, or they don't care that much about how well they're learning, will tend to gravitate towards those easier things. And I think this is one of the major barriers that educators have to deal with, because if the student wants to always do the easiest thing and they don't want to do the things that really matter for learning, it can be hard for a teacher or a curriculum designer to create a curriculum that students will actually want to do the work that's necessary to learn. So my goal in all this is to try to talk directly to the students, so that if they know these principles and they care about how well they learn something, they can themselves kind of operate in a more effective way.
Yeah, and then that may help them not regretting later, when in future sometime when they need that kind of knowledge and they thought, oh, I would have been more, should have given more attention to when we were learning.
Well, I think one other thing I would just add to that is that this kind of difficulty or intensity often trades off for the amount of time you need. So if you're getting more efficient studying, then maybe you don't need the same volume of studying. And so I think a lot of us get into a trap a little bit with our learning, is that we use a somewhat ineffective approach. We get bad results. We have kind of low confidence. And so we put in even more time, but we don't change the quality of our methods. And so you can see this with students who are mediocre students, but they put in huge amounts of time and they don't get great results, and they feel kind of depressed about it, or they feel really demotivated by their learning. And so what I'm trying to propose is a more virtuous cycle where you do something that's a little bit more deliberate, a little bit harder, but you don't have to study quite so much to get the same result, and you feel more confident in yourself, and I think that this can manifest itself in some of these extreme examples I had. Like, for me, the experience of learning a language this way compared to learning it in school was like night and day for my own self-confidence, for like, oh, no, this works just so much better. But I think until you've experienced that, it's very difficult to kind of pull that trigger. And so that's sort of what I'm trying to do.
Yeah, and in your book, you mentioned about meta learning, which I really find very interesting concept to make to get the most out of your experience. Tell us a little bit more about the different parts of meta learning, what it is, and how it
Right. So meta learning, if you're not familiar with that prefix, usually means when something's about itself. So meta learning is learning about learning, or thinking about how you learn. And I usually, like, the way I contrast it is, uh, again, using my favorite example of languages, learning a language is learning words and grammar. And whereas meta learning would be learning how to acquire words and grammar in a language. So you can see how those are a little bit different. So if you had a lot of meta learning, you might not know a particular language, but you know kind of this is the right way to go about it. And I think this is very important for learning lots of subjects, because um, a lot of subjects have particular details about, okay, well, this is the right way to do it. And if you've spent a lot of time with it, it becomes increasingly obvious that that's the kind of the only way to successfully learn it. But at the same time, if you're a beginner, that may not be obvious to you, and so you may spend a lot of time doing something fairly ineffective for learning. And I'm talking about a lot of general principles, this sort of direct practice. We've talked about immersion a lot, retrieval versus review. These are general principles of learning, so they do apply across projects. But often what you want is, hyper specific. So it'll be like, oh, if I'm trying to learn this programming language, you want to start by doing this, and this, instead of this, and that. And so the idea of meta learning is that you want to construct a map of what you're trying to learn before you begin. And a lot of educators and a lot of teachers will try to provide this map for you. They create what they think is the map of what you should learn. But I think even if you're going to go into a formal classroom situation, even if you're going to enroll in university and trust that, someone's thought about what are the topics you should learn, you should still work to kind of create this map yourself. For the first reason is that it helps you see where you're going. So if you're, learning calculus in this class and it seems pointless, why are you learning it? Presumably someone thought it would be important for you later on. It would be help to know where you're going. And then the second reason, I think, is that it often helps you decide where to invest some of your resources and where to invest some of your time. So one of the main methods that I talk about in the book for determining this map is what I call the expert interview method, where you find people who have learned what you wanted to learn and just ask them, what resources they recommend, how they learned it, what process did they use. And this can kind of help you get a sense of, okay, what's out there and what can I use for that. And even just doing your research, and instead of just like grabbing the first book off the shelf, you do a little bit of research, find, okay, there's these dozen books and this is maybe the best one. Because if you can spend an hour figuring out what the best resource is, and the resource is only 10% better than the best resource, which is, I would say, is modest. Often they're twice or three times as good. But if it takes you 100 hours to do the project, you've invested 1 hour to basically saved yourself 10 hours in the long run, even for such a small gain. So I find that one of the major missteps that we make is we don't do enough planning or enough research or enough preparation in our projects. And so we kind of either pick bad strategies or we pick random strategies, and we don't really get the most out of what we could when learning.
So, what are the components of your meta learning map? There's something like map, right?
Right. So there's a few ways to look at it. So one of the ways I've already kind of talked about, which is to sort of divide it up into different materials. So, if I'm learning a language, do I want to use Pimsleur, Duolingo? Do I want to make my own flashcards? Am I going to get a tutor on Italki? Am I going to get a textbook? Like, there's, any language you want to learn, there's hundreds of different resources, totally different ways of doing it. And I would argue they range probably by orders of magnitude in their overall effectiveness as well. But then there's also, I would say, within the topic itself, you can divide it into different kind of types of learning challenges. So in the book, I talk about concepts, facts, and procedures. So concepts being things that you have to understand, facts being things you have to memorize, and procedures being things you have to do or perform. And if you divide it up this way, you can often see that certain skills are like really concept heavy, like mathematics or physics, where it's mostly understanding a difficult idea. And then there's things that are really fact heavy, like anatomy, or languages are very fact heavy. You need to know thousands of words to be able to speak proficiently. And then there's things that are procedurally heavy. So learning a sport or a musical instrument is mostly going to be that. And that's also helpful because I think if you don't make that division, you can sometimes just blindly say, oh, someone told me that flashcards are good. You know, I got an email the other day from someone who said, I want to use flashcards for learning music. But to me, music, if you're playing an instrument, is such a procedurally heavy subject. I'm not sure what you would learn with flashcards there. Flashcards are very much for dealing with factual problems. Similarly, if you're trying to do something that's deeply conceptual and your whole strategy is I'm going to memorize a lot of things, you might also be backfiring because you are not really understanding things. You're just sort of memorizing definitions. And so how you can chop up the subject, that's a pretty loose division. Obviously, with a particular subject, you can divide it up even more. Languages obviously have like vocabulary, grammar, pronunciation, but that's just particular to languages. Other subjects don't have those distinctions. And so the more you can kind of make this map at a finer and finer level, you can get a sense of, before you even begin learning, what do you think the process will be for learning this? And you'll update your map as you go along, as you, okay, that didn't work, let's try something else. But the more that you can do this in advance, you can make sure you sort of get yourself on the right footing. So, before you even start learning a language, you can realize that remembering all the words is going to be a bottleneck. If I can remember the words better, then I will perform better in the language. So what are good ways of doing that? And so I think the more you can kind of encourage this sort of thinking early on, the more likely you are to, devote yourself to methods that are going to work.
Hmm. So, in the procedure heavy skills that you want to acquire,
Mm-hmm.
you mentioned about sports. How is in ultra learning, how we can make the sports learning experience better than the traditional way? Like an
Right.
example.
So I think, again, going back to this expert interview method, the way that I would start is, if I'm going to be learning a sport that there's lots of elite level coaching for, and there's been tons and tons of people at the kind of Olympic level figuring out what's the right way to learn the sport, these would be the people I would start with. I would read books by them. I would study them. So I wouldn't listen to me, for instance, of like, what's the right way to learn golf, because I'm not particularly good at golf. But if I was trying to get good at golf, I would look at what do sort of elite golfing coaches think is the right way to learn golf, and what are the components and what are the difficulties and these kinds of things. So that's probably where I would start. But in terms of a kind of general recipe, there's some ideas for procedural learning that I think are important. So one idea is that is this idea of deliberate practice, which is that when you are performing a kind of complex skill that has a lot of different procedures, there's going to be some parts that are much more difficult than other parts. If you're playing a violin, there's going to be a very, very difficult piece, and then there's going to be lots of parts of it that are pretty easy for you. And what they find is that the musicians that sort of do really, really well, they are extremely focused on those difficult parts and mastering them and working on them bit by bit by bit. Whereas the person who's just sort of interested in doing it for fun will maybe play the whole song and not worry too much if they screw up that hard part. The idea here is that if you focus on these sort of very difficult parts, you can spend, you can do way more repetitions of that difficult part in a shorter period of time than if you do the entire song. And so similarly with a lot of skills, this kind of zooming in on what are the difficult aspects of it can be important. The other thing is you see in sports is constructing drills that will focus on some element of the skill that maybe isn't practiced that much in the regular activity. So in basketball, for instance, people will often do layup drills or passing drills or shooting drills because these are going to be kind of random and haphazard in an actual game. And you've got a lot of situations, there's only one ball on the court. Lots of players aren't even dribbling or using the ball at the time. And so if you realize, I've got a weakness with layups, I can just do layups over and over again. And so this is just a few of the ideas. I talk about more of them in the book, but you can see how if you start applying this kind of thinking of what actually needs to be accomplished to learn something well. And in a procedural skill, You've got all these different muscle movements that need to be coordinated. You've got all these different discriminations that need to be made, like, okay, this is a good time to do this play, or this is a good time to do that play. And you need to practice those. And so this kind of mapping it out, figuring out what you need to do, this is where I'm going to focus on it. This is the kind of heart of ultra learning. And I should be clear here, this is not a novelty that I'm inventing here, but rather this is sort of a process I'm trying to kind of describe with this term of ultra learning, describe people who are aggressive autodidacts. So.
Yeah, definitely. And that's really useful in today's world when you have to learn so many different things because the world is changing so fast. The skills, I mean, talk about in technology, you have to upskill yourself very frequently. So your learning experience should be super quick and very productive. Now that brings me to the fact that you only have 24 hours and you have to learn a lot, especially
Mm-hmm.
nowadays. Even though we say that everything is available on Google, you just go and search for it, but you still need a lot of skills that you need to acquire. What is your approach to use your time more effectively so that, I mean, you've done 4-year degree in
Mm-hmm.
1 year, so I think nobody is a better person to tell me about how to manage your time, 24 hours to make the most of it.
Right. So I think it all starts with asking, what are you trying to accomplish? So I do think time management is important. I do think allocating your time wisely matters. But I feel like for most people, the problem is that they don't really have any structure for their efforts. So they're not really working against any kind of concrete goal or concrete project. They're not allocating any time toward it. So it's a little bit like saying, well, what's the right way of optimizing something that no one's doing? And so in this case, I think what I would like to suggest is, even if we just start with the mentality of having a serious learning project, a project where you have some goal that you're trying to accomplish, and you are going to set your schedule to actually try to put in the time to work on it. Let's use that as the sort of starting point. I think there's certainly some goals where you might recognize, this is a kind of ineffective way of doing it. Maybe I can do it more effectively and then do it in a shorter time frame, or do it with less total hours invested. And I try to highlight some of those projects. But I think the kind of where I would use as a starting point is that most people don't really have projects at all. They don't really sort of seriously set out to learn anything. Maybe I'll get a book and then do it whenever I have time, but they're not actually doing what I'm describing here. They're not making a map. They're not allocating some time in their schedule. They're not doing any of those things. And so I think you can gain a lot of progress in your own life with the skills that matter to you, with the things that you actually care about, just by making it a project, just by sort of committing yourself to, like, okay, for the next 3 months, I'm going to work on X. And even if you're not doing anything crazy efficient, I think you'll make a lot more progress than the sort of haphazard way that most people approach things.
And I couldn't agree more about your structure, having a structure and having a predefined goal approach. And I saw one of the example that you gave in another videos about somebody who took part in speech contest, and
Mm-hmm.
that reminded me of my story because I did the same thing. And in order to be eligible for that contest, the World Championship of Speaking, you have to finish at least 7 speeches. And when I joined the club, I didn't have 7 speeches, so I said I have to be eligible for it, and we only had a month, so I did 7 speeches in 1 month, just because I knew
Mm-hmm.
where I have to go. So it really works if you have your goal set, and then you then can create a structure to achieve that. Definitely.
And I think even just setting out the idea of, I want to learn X or be proficient at a particular skill or work on, you know, completing a course or an exam or something like that. Like, even just having these particular goals and then working backwards to, okay, I'm going to invest some time every day in doing this, is huge. And I think a lot of us have experience with pursuing these kinds of goals in formal environments. So I would say, like, I know many very smart and competent people that they, did well in school, and maybe they even did a master's or a doctorate, but they don't have a lot of experience with this kind of self-directed learning where, no one was going to fail them out of college if they didn't put in the time. But I think this kind of self-directed approach to doing things, while I admit like you do need to have a lot of motivation and need to be serious about it, I think cultivating that skill of creating your own project and sticking to it and seeing it to the finish line, if you can do that, then kind of the learning efficiency angle is a little bit secondary, just because if you have the ability to just construct a project that you can stick to even on what you might think is the normal pace, you're probably going to accumulate a lot more skills and knowledge in the long run. And so I think the kind of idea of learning those things more efficiently, it really comes after you have this context where you're working on a defined project. Like, talking about what's the right way to learn a language efficiently only kind of really matters in the context of, okay, I'm going to be in Spain for the next 6 weeks, let's try to learn as much Spanish as we can. It only really makes sense in that context. It doesn't make sense in the context of, well, I wasn't really putting in any time or effort to learn a language to begin with, and your efficiency doesn't really matter.
This is quite motivational. And whenever I see something like this, how to increase your productivity or how to be better at what you are, at whatever you're doing, these kind of interviews when I personally watch, I feel quite motivated, and I probably will go and take a step or two in order to
Mm-hmm.
do that. But the problem with motivation is that it is very short lived and it dies if you
Mm-hmm.
do not get the recharge again on the next day or maybe next week or something.
Mm-hmm.
How to make these things habits, and eventually they will become part of your life. What is your approach to that?
So, so I think I don't want to be dismissive of habits in the least. I think that they're very important, but I think the kind of psychological process that I'm sort of describing here is more deliberate. That there is a process of making habitual, let's say, speaking another language, or doing these sorts of things, but the amount of intensity or effort in a lot of these projects, I think it has to be something that you really have a strong obsession almost about it to want to pursue. This isn't to say that you can still practice recall even if you're not obsessed. Like, a lot of the methods I talk about in the book work, but these kind of extreme results and these extreme projects that I'm talking about, they really have to start from this kernel of sort of deep enthusiasm for something that you really want to do and that you think is going to be really cool. And so that's sort of where I start a lot of times, is what is something that really excites you? What's something that you're going to be really interested in? And I feel like too often we are in a situation where we've never felt like that about learning anything before, because we've been in school and we just have to do it because we're told to do it and we're in this formal environment. And so a lot of students, they have this experience of like, well, how do I motivate myself to study for some particular exam that's coming up? And yeah, I know I should do it, but I'm procrastinating a lot. And like, yeah, those are good. And I mean, it's good to like have good habits and make sure you get yourself to studying early and use the Pomodoro technique and all this kind of thing. But I think what I'm really trying to advocate in this book is trying to encourage some people, not everyone, but some people, to find something that's like really exciting to them, something that like they can't stop thinking about, and they're like, that would be so cool, and it's worth obsessing over. It's worth putting the effort in. And I've been lucky enough to have a few of those things that have happened in my life, but I think you only really need like one or two of those experiences to, I think, open your mind up to doing new things. And so you were using the example of Tristan, who did so well in the Toastmasters. He competed in the finals for the World Championship of Public Speaking about 7 months after he started. And it was like that for him. It kind of started with this sort of like, what, maybe I'd like to get better at public speaking. And then he's like, starts thinking about the idea a little bit more, starts planning the project, starts thinking about it, and it gets more exciting for him. And then he sort of gets on this path that kind of steamrolls, and it gets more and more exciting. Or, the language learning project for me was this kind of like a year or so before I started thinking about it, started planning it. And so I think the way that I'm trying to encourage people to think about things as well as not just how do I get better at learning the things that I have to do that I really have no interest in, but asking yourself, what are you really interested in? Like, life's short, and I think it's good to work on hard things that you really care about.
Find your passion, find your why. That's just
Mhm.
another long discussion in itself. Right. So once you have acquired the skill, you've learned it, how do you retain it for long?
Right. So I think this is different for different skills. I think that memory intensive skills tend to degrade more quickly. So I can say in particular, that's something that I kind of learned after doing the language learning project is just that I think that was um, an underestimation I made that learning to a particular level of proficiency for the language is actually a lot easier than maintaining it over, let's say, like a decade or two. And that I think is made particularly bad by the fact that if you learn like 4 or 5, like right now I'm maintaining about 6 languages, and so it's definitely a lot of work because you get interference between the other ones. So if you know Portuguese and Spanish, there's a lot of overlap, but places they don't overlap, and so maintaining those sort of distinctions is also challenging. And so I think there's a few different approaches you can take. One approach is simply to take a relearn when you need it approach. And I know this, we're talking about retaining, so this seems almost fatalist, but there is some evidence that when you re-expose yourself to ideas that you've forgotten, that you'll acquire them more quickly. So it's not like the value of learning isn't there, it's just that the benefit comes from a shorter relearning period. So that can be beneficial for some skills that you maybe don't need to have at hand. Like it's I can relearn it if I need it. The other approach you can take is a specific maintenance schedule. So this is what I decided to do with language learning is I actually set up, after I finished the trip, once a week, kind of conversation tutoring sessions in each of these languages so that I could kind of maintain it for a longer period of time. And that's been fairly successful, although admittedly it is also a fair bit of work. And the other approach that you can do is to go one step beyond. So you master the ability by taking on another project that kind of pushes it to the next level. And there's some interesting research that this can assist in the longevity of your memory and understanding of the level beneath that. So there's one study that I really like where it looked at people who took an algebra class and how much knowledge they retained over time. And what they found is that the rate of decay was the same for good and sort of poor students. So yes, the good students knew more, so they also knew more later, but the amount that they forgot, the proportion of their knowledge was about the same over time. However, there was a sort of different group that did not have such a steep decline, and this was the people who did calculus. So you can imagine that in going ahead to learn calculus, you are kind of taking the algebra knowledge and sort of using it in a more difficult scenario. You're really mastering it in a way that it becomes more durable and lasts even longer. So you can think of that as well for skills that you really want to master. This sort of going up a notch can also work. So I think these three approaches are all strategies that I recommend. And I think that there's probably some ways of learning that tend to promote retention more long term. So one of them is spaced repetition. So the idea that if you expose yourself to information over multiple different periods of time, rather than just doing it all at once, that tends to promote better retention in the long run. Also, what I mentioned about before, this kind of overlearning, or the idea that like you keep practicing something beyond what you need to do to be proficient in, tends to extend the length of the memory. So that was one thing that we noticed when we were doing this language learning trials, that if you were in a classroom, for instance, learning a language, you would probably do unit 1 and then you move on to unit 2 and then you move on to unit 3. And although there is some repetition of concepts and words from before, just by the nature of trying to teach something, you tend to underemphasize the core basics compared to the later stuff, just because you don't have space to repeat everything in unit 1 also in unit 3. But if you're actually using a language in a real situation, there are certain phrases and patterns that you're going to use hundreds of times or thousands of times, which is way, way, way more than you might encounter in a normally paced classroom environment that's trying to be, efficient at covering all the concepts. And as a result, those sort of core features of the language tend to be like really, really well memorized with this approach, which may not be the case if you only did a kind of classroom study.
This is really useful. Mm. There is a lot I can learn from you about learning, Scott. But in the interest of time, I'll ask you one question which I ask all
Sure.
my guests, which is, according to you, what are the top 3 skills that everybody needs in order to grow and be successful, but schools are not teaching it?
I think the first skill I would put is personal kind of productivity and self management. and I put that at the top of the list because I think we have all of these inherent biases in how we process things, that we tend to be very short-term focused. We tend to not have a lot of planning, and we live in a modern society where you need to have long-term thinking. You need to have the things that you want to achieve 5 years from now influencing your actions today, even though they often rarely do. And so I think if you have a personal kind of productivity system where all the stuff that you need to do or all the goals you're working on filter down into a daily to-do list, or this is what I need to do today, or these are the things that I have to perform, that's very important. I think a second skill I would say that I think all people would have to do is the skill of executing their own projects. And I would say learning projects are a subcategory of that, but the ability to kind of design something that you want to achieve and then going out and achieving it. So I would relate that to the productivity system, but I think it goes beyond that because you can definitely use a productivity system just to manage all the other goals the society puts on you. But I think it's something different to kind of set out your own project, to work on something of your own design. And I think that's a very valuable skill, just because so often in the kind of buffet of life, we're just choosing from the options the society has decided to lay out in front of us. And for some of us, those options are really, really good and we'll get really far with that. But for some of us, maybe our immediate environment doesn't have the greatest options. And so the skill of creating those things yourself is going to be really important. And I think the final thing, if I can avoid repeating myself too much, is just the ability to learn new subjects, new skills. And I think part of that's related to this idea of project design and structuring. But even just having that kind of confidence that you can go out and learn something that you're interested in, I think is such a valuable skill, because that can be applied to learn any other skill that you might need in life.
Great. So now you have a best-selling book under your belt, and you have done a lot of work in this area. You've learned yourself a lot of new stuff. What is your goal now? What's your mission?
Well, I think I've always been very interested in some of the things that we're talking about motivation, about productivity. And so I've been doing more research in some of those dimensions. I've spent a lot of time focusing on learning, memory, kind of these aspects in my book. But I think ultimately a lot of the things that we really struggle with and really need are related to those aspects. So that's where I'm doing research now. I don't know where it's going to lead exactly, but maybe with another book or maybe with more articles.
Okay, all the best with that.
Thank you.
Okay, great. Thanks, Scott. It was really lovely talking to you. I learned a lot about learning. Thanks a lot for your time. Thanks for being on the show.
Thank you for having me.
Guys, if you are looking to know more about the work that Scott has done, please do check out his book called Ultra Learning. It is available everywhere. I'll leave the link for Amazon here. And if you have not yet done so, and if this episode has added some value to you, then please do consider subscribing to this channel by clicking the subscribe button and the bell icon. I will see you again next week. Till then, take care.